Good morning, students. Today we are going to learn the exogenetic processes, that is chapter 3. Last time we had done the endogenetic process. Endogenetic process was the internal movements inside the surface of the earth. In the internal movements we learned about volcanoes and earthquakes. Now this chapter we are going to learn about the exogenetic processes. Now exogenetic processes is the external factors that we find on the surface of the earth. Now there are many internal movements we learned last time. This chapter we are going to look at the external factors. Okay, so let us see the external processes. The external processes have weathering, okay, we have erosion, we have transportation, and we have deposition. Now, what is weathering? That is what we are going to learn in this chapter. Along with weathering, when weathering happens, we have the erosion taking place, then we have the transportation of the eroded material, and these transported materials have to be deposited somewhere. So we have the deposition. So weathering, erosion, transportation, and deposition are the external processes. In this chapter, we'll be having a detailed view about what is weathering. Okay. Now students, let us see what is once we have seen the primary and the secondary landforms. Now these primary and secondary landforms, they give rise to tertiary landforms. Now what are these tertiary landforms? Okay, tertiary landforms are valleys, we have sand dunes and deltas and U-shaped valleys. You can see this is a V-shaped valley. Now these are all happening because of the primary and secondary landforms. Okay, in the primary landforms, as I told you, we have the external processes which work on them: weathering, erosion, transportation, and deposition. Now all these things would give rise to tertiary landforms, that are valleys, V-shaped valleys. You have U-shaped valleys. You can see this U shape, that is it resembles the letter U in English alphabet. That is why we call it as a U-shaped valley, whereas this represents the letter V, so we call it as a V-shaped valley. Now these are sand dunes. This is also a work because of the erosional work. Then here we have depositional work, the deltas. That is, deltas are the regions from where the rivers meet the sea. When the rivers come and meet the sea, we have deltas formed at the mouth of the river. Mouth of the river means the place where the river meets the sea is what we call as the mouth of the river. So from the primary and the secondary landforms, we have another landform, we call it as the tertiary landforms, and these tertiary landforms are valleys, sand dunes, deltas, and U-shaped valleys. I hope that is clear to everyone. Next we have weathering. Now what is weathering? Now in the textbook it is given the natural phenomenon of breaking or weakening of rocks is called as weathering. Now what is this breaking or weakening of rocks? That is what we are going to learn in this chapter. Okay, the phenomenon of breaking, natural phenomenon. Nobody is breaking the rocks with using a hammer or things like that. Here it is a natural phenomenon, how rocks a big rock breaks into two pieces, and then again that two pieces again it gets broken into smaller pieces. So that natural phenomenon of breaking or weakening of rocks is called as weathering. The breaking of rocks into smaller particles is what we call as weathering. I suppose you understood what is weathering. I'll repeat it again. The natural phenomenon of breaking or weakening of rocks is called as weathering. I suppose it is clear to you. Now let us look at the types of weathering. Now there are three types of weathering, students. The first one is mechanical or physical weathering. Mechanical weathering is also known as physical weathering. Then we have chemical weathering, and we have and we have biological weathering. Okay, so these are the three types of weathering that we have: physical or mechanical weathering, chemical weathering, and biological weathering. These are the three types of weathering. Now today we are only going to look at this physical weathering. What is physical weathering? How does physical weathering take place? Now let us look at what is physical or mechanical weathering. The first type of physical weathering is called as exfoliation. Now I'll be explaining each one of these to you in detail. Okay, the first one in physical weathering is exfoliation. The second one is called block disintegration. Now when you look at the pictures only, you'll come to know how these are different. Okay, the next one is called shattering. Now we'll look at all these different types of physical weathering. How does exfoliation takes place, or how do block disintegration take place, or how does shattering take place? Okay, so that in physical weathering there are three types: exfoliation, block disintegration, and shattering. Let us look at exfoliation. Now exfoliation is also called as onion peeling. In your textbook it is given that they have told us to do an experiment. They have told us to take an onion and peel it. The outer cover we peel it, and when you go on peeling it, you will find different layers in it, isn't it? The same technique is what happens on the rock. If this thing doesn't happen on a onion, it happens on a rock. Okay, so let us see how that happens. Now you can see these, students, you can see there are these layers. Layers of these are being broken away on this rock. That is, why does this happen? I'll tell you. See, the exposed part of the rock gets more heat. That means the top part of the rock, it is exposed to the sun's heat. So the upper part of it gets lot of heat. The inner part is comparatively cooler. If you compare it with the outer part, the inner part is comparatively cooler. Okay, so what happens is that the outer layer of the rocks fall apart from the main rock. Now how does this happen? I'll tell you. See, the exposed part is the outer layer. The outer layer is exposed to the heat. When it is exposed to heat, the minerals inside the rock, they expand. You know, in science we have studied that when things are heated, it expands. So in the same way, when the sun's light falls on the upper layer of these rocks, the minerals that are present inside the rocks, they expand. Okay, they become wider. Whereas the inner part is comparatively cooler. Now what happens is that the outer part is exposed during the night time, and the temperature decreases, so the contraction happens. That means when the temperature is more, expansion takes place. When the temperature is less, contraction. So this constant expanding and contracting leads to the outer layer of the rocks to fall apart from the main rock. Now this process is what we call as exfoliation. I hope it is understood, students. Exfoliation means it's just like an onion peeling. It's also called as onion peeling effect. What happens is that the outer part, that is exposed part of the rock, gets more heat, whereas the inner part remains cooler. So because of this constant heat and coolness, what happens? The expansion and contraction is continuous process. So because of that, the outer layer of the rocks fall apart from the main rock. Now this is what is called as exfoliation. I suppose this part is understood to everyone. Okay, the next part we'll see is mechanical weathering occurs because of the following reasons. That means, why do physical weathering happen? Okay, what are the reasons for the physical weathering? Physical weathering, I told you, it is also called as mechanical weathering. So don't get confused between physical and mechanical. Why I am telling physical weathering as well as mechanical weathering. Both are the same. Okay. Now first thing what first reason for a physical weathering to happen is temperature. When the temperature increases or the temperature decreases. Then there is frost. Frost means the ice. Then crystal growth. I'll be explaining it to you one by one now. The next is release of pressure. We'll see how shattering takes place because of that. And water. Now these are the 5 reasons which causes physical weathering. First one is temperature. Second is frost. Third is crystal growth. Fourth is release of pressure. And the last one is water. Now we'll be looking at these reasons one by one. First we'll look at temperature. Okay, now when you look at this figure, students, you'll see that the sun's light is falling on this rock. Okay, the sun's light is falling on this rock. So the minerals in rock expand due to heat and contracts when the temperature decreases. Now when does it decrease? During the night time. Okay, during the daytime the sun's heat falls on the rock. During the night time the temperature decreases. So the minerals in the rocks expand due to heat and contracts when temperature decreases. Now continuous contraction and expansion leads to tension in the rocks. Last chapter we had seen the tension. Because of tension what happens? Volcanoes and the plates are divided and then we have earthquakes happening, isn't it? So this constant contraction and expansion leads to tension in the rocks and it starts to crack and then ultimately it breaks down. Okay, so mostly this thing will occur in a desert region. Why in a desert region? Because that is the only place where you'll find there is a big range in the difference of daytime and nighttime temperature. Daytime it is completely hot, like very very hot, extremely hot, whereas nighttime it is very very cold. So this constant rise in temperature and the decrease in temperature will lead to tension in the rocks and ultimately that will lead to the breaking away of the rocks and the cracking of the rocks and then the breaking away of the rocks. So the first thing that we have seen, how do physical weathering take place? Because of temperature. This is one of the reasons. I suppose that is clear to everyone. Okay. Now next one is frost. Okay. Now this is very easy to understand, students. How does frost help in physical weathering? Now you see, now when there is a crack in a rock, what happens? Water gets filled in this crack. You can see it's a small crack. So water gets filled in the crack. The next picture that you see here, this water during the night time, what happens? It turns to ice because the temperature has gone down very drastically. So the crack in which water was filled, it turns to ice. Now you must have observed when you keep water in the fridge, in your freezer, you can see how it turns to ice. And when it turns to ice, you'll see how it expands. Now when water turns into ice, it expands. That means it needs more space. Now in between the rocks there is little space. So what happens? The water, when it expands, it creates more space for itself. And when it creates more space for itself, it tries to widen the crack in the rock. And then ultimately the rock breaks. So this is called as frost wedging. So one of the second reason why physical weathering takes place is because the water which gets filled in the crack, that water turns to ice, and when it turns to ice, it expands, and with the expansion it breaks the rock, or it widens the crack in the rock, and ultimately the rocks break. So I hope this is also clear to everyone. The next one is crystal growth. Now this you will usually find near coastal areas, students. Okay, crystal growth. Now this occurs when salt water enters a crack in a rock and then evaporates. Now you must have done this experiment in your lower classes. Your science teacher had always how to show that what remains. You are told to put water mixed with salt. Okay, keep it keep it outside in the sun. When the water evaporates, what remains back? It is salt, isn't it? The same procedure helps here because seawater is salty. So what happens? When the seawater enters the cracks in a rock and then the water gets evaporated, what is remaining? The salt. The salt remains in the rock. So it leaves behind salt crystals which can exert force and enlarge the crack. So as is happening, because for water we need little space, but when it is a solid substance it requires more space. So it acquires more space inside the rock and ultimately it would lead to the cracks in the rock. Okay, now and you can see that sometimes if you go near a seaside, a rocky cliff near a seaside, you'll find there are rocks like this. Now it looks like a honeycomb, students. Okay, it looks like a honeycomb because you'll find holes in these rocks. Now these are not man-made thing. Okay, these are naturally happening thing. This is how it is because of the crystal growth. How does it happen? When the salt water, because mostly it occurs in the coastal areas, when the salt water enters a crack in the rock and the water evaporates, it leaves behind salt crystals which can exert force and enlarge the cracks. Okay, so such type of rocks you will mostly find in a coastal region. Now the alkaline water, this because the salt water is alkaline, salty water is alkaline. So alkaline water gets stored in the halls and because of the heat, that is when the sun's light falls on it, it evaporates. And only the crystals of alkaline materials, it remains on the rocks. And that would lead to, so the crystals need more space. So this causes tension in the rocks and the rocks break. Sometimes so it appears to be like this. It appears like a honeycomb. Okay, I hope this crystal growth, how it helps in physical weathering is clear to everyone. Okay, the next one is release of pressure. How because of release of pressure the rocks break. Okay, now you can see what happens is that the outer layer, the outer layer of the rocks, it exerts a certain pressure on the inner layers. Okay, the outer layer, it exerts pressure on the inner layer. When sometimes this pressure, it is not there at all. Sometimes the pressure is less. So when the pressure ceases to exist, the lower or thinner layer gets freed from the pressure. So as a result of that, the rocks deep in the crust are under great pressure exerted from the overlying rocks. But when there is no pressure at all, it leads to the no pressure having on the thinner layer. So as I told you before also, this constant exertion and so again it is expanding and contracting. So again that would lead to breaking away of the rocks and which would lead to physical weathering. Now this release of pressure, you'll find that sometimes you can hear on rocky areas like a blast. You can hear a blast. Now why does this blast happens? It's because the rocks are shattered because of the release of pressure. It's just like a small volcano, but we don't have volcanic eruptions coming out of here. It is all rocks which breaks into smaller pieces. That is because of the pressure that is released from the inner layer to the outer layer at all of a sudden. Okay, when all of a sudden the pressure is released, it breaks the outer layer of the rocks and that also leads to physical weathering. So that is the reason how the release of pressure can lead to physical weathering. I hope that is clear to everyone. Okay, now the last part of it is water. Water is a main ingredient, students. Okay, water is the basic thing that would dissolve lot of things. Now water is also one of the reasons why we have the physical weathering happening. Now here you can see a rock. Now it's called a conglomerate rock. Now you will ask me, what is a conglomerate rock? Conglomerate rock is a type of sedimentary rock. Now sedimentary rocks, you'll have learnt it in the previous years. What a sedimentary rock? It is a rock which is formed because of the deposition of sediments one over the other. In this rock you will find lot of materials like plants, the fossils of plants and animals, soil, what do you call, water. It's mixed with all those things, and what happens is that the top layer gets compressed, puts pressure on the lower layer, and it gets compressed, the lower layer gets compressed. So as a result of that, the rocks are compressed, pressed with each other, and it turns into a rock. All the layers one over the air get pressed and it turns into a rock. Now that is called as a sedimentary rock. Now this sedimentary rock, as I told you, it has got lot of things present inside it. So it might also have sand, it might have other things. So when water falls into these rocks, the rocks are soaked by this water. You all know that when we soak something in water, how it gets disintegrated. Okay, in the same manner, here when the water, because of the rainfall, when water falls on these rocks soak this water. All the water is soaked, and when the whole water is soaked by the rock, the sand that is present inside those rocks, it loosens up, the particles loosens up, and then it separates from the main rock. So as a result of that, granular disintegration takes place. Now granular disintegration is when water penetrates rocks which are combined by mud, and the particles get loose and separate from the main rock. That means from this main rock, the conglomerate rock, which has got a lot of sand and small rocks, when water seeps inside the rock, what happens is that the particles gets loosened and it gets separated, and then ultimately it forms into these tiny particles. That means sand is washed away and only the tiny rocks remain. So that is called as granular disintegration. Now this happens because of water, that is the rainwater which we receive from the rainfall. Another one is called block disintegration. Now block disintegration is also in the same way, students. You have seen how water enters the cracks, and the cracks, when the temperature decreases, the water inside the cracks, it widens, isn't it? That I had already explained it before. So water and temperature both causes this physical weathering, and that is the block disintegration. I hope this is clear to everyone. One is because of the rainfall, the water seeps inside these rocks like conglomerate rocks and sandstone, and the particles in these rocks, they get loosen up and they separate from the main rock, and granular disintegration takes place. When water enters into small cracks and the gap widens, when the water freezes, it is called as block disintegration. You can see how this particular rock has been split into two because of the water which has turned into ice, and then it had widened the gap. So this is how water is the main reason which causes physical disintegration. Okay, physical weathering, not it is a type of disintegration only, because rocks are breaking into smaller pieces. Okay, so water is the main reason why there is physical weathering taking place. I hope everybody understood what is this physical weathering or mechanical weathering. In the next chapter, in the next topic, we'll be covering up the chemical weathering as well as the biological weathering. I hope everybody understood what is physical weathering. Thank you, students.